Crypt of the Serpent King is a game very similar in style and tone to Kingsfield. It seems to wear its inspiration on its sleeve, and I liked Kingsfield and games inspired by Kingsfield and its combat system, as well as its mood. The goal in Crypt of the Serpent King is to explore 7 levels, obtaining all of the keys in each level and fighting the boss at the end, until you defeat the Serpent King himself, and that's really all you get for story. The dungeons are randomly generated, though it's sadly the case that all the rooms look so similar that it's not likely to matter too much upon repeat playthroughs that the rooms are random. The randomization seems very simple, with the game simply deciding whether there's a key room or a hallway and then connecting key rooms or hallways to it randomly. The size of the map is determined by how many keys are inside of it, and frankly, if I didn't know for sure the game was randomly generated by playing through it multiple times, you could have lied to me and said it wasn't, and I wouldn't have noticed. Not because the game is so well put together that all of the maps seem deliberately and meticulously designed by individual human thought, but rather because all of the rooms are so similar it's hard to say. Each of the levels also offers very little in design variation. Each level tries to make a spectacle out of the key rooms, putting some kind of hazard between you and the key, but only level 2 has a truly unique hazard, and all of the other hazards are just pits that are easily jumped over by a single hop. Exploration is encouraged via treasure chests, which contain both gold and healing items, which puts a bit of a disconnect between the exploration mechanics and combat, making them almost completely separate. And you might be thinking, surely not, for when I enter a room and see a treasure chest, I am in danger from the enemy guarding that treasure chest. Enemies are a threat and an obstacle, after all. You may be wrong about that. With the exception of boss fights, which are mandatory to fight, it's actually possible to just evade all of the enemies and open treasure chests without paying them any mind. I actually found it easier to just swerve around the enemies than to actually confront them in most circumstances, though I did bother to fight them all so I could get a good idea of the combat system. I did complete at least the final level without fighting a single enemy though, and it was noticeably faster and less taxing than actually fighting individual enemies. Certainly didn't stop me from opening any treasure chests or doors either. The game does try to encourage the player to fight enemies by rewarding experience, so that way you can upgrade your stats in between levels. However, the stats your character has are much less important than the weapon they are carrying, and the weapon they're carrying is bought with gold, which is distinctly not something you get from fighting enemies, but rather something obtained from treasure chests which you can open without fighting the easily avoidable enemies. And I do hate to harp on what is ultimately a good decision for game design, but there is a distinct musical cue that triggers whenever an enemy is near you, so that makes them all the easier to avoid. It may be beneficial to fight all the enemies for 1 or 2 levels, so you have enough mobility stat to evade some of the trickier ones in levels 6 and 7, but I don't even think that's truly necessary, leaving only the boss fights as a source of genuine difficulty and reason to engage with the combat system. The combat system is very simple, much like Kingsfield, and consists mostly of back and forth determining your swing speed and the enemies and the reach of their own weapon. All the enemies do attack at different speeds and have different hitboxes on their attacks, so you do need to actively pay attention to how far back you need to move to dodge their swipes. But that is all you have to do to dodge their swipes, is move back. Then you move in forward when their attack animation is finished, and swipe away with your weapon of choice. To the game's credit, your reticle does turn red when an enemy is able to be hit, so you know exactly what the range of your own weapon is. There's sort of a back and forth bobbing harmony to the combat, where you lure an enemy into attacking, wait for their attack to finish, and then counterattack. It's a bit like a dance. And this simplistic dancing combat system, with its minor nuances in regards to weapon variety and enemy variety, is probably my favorite thing about the game, but again, when most of the enemies are avoidable and you only need to fight the bosses, it kind of puts a damper on the whole thing. Not to mention that aside from the boss, there is only one enemy type available per level, which essentially means you get one combat puzzle to solve per level, and most of the combat puzzles are solved instantaneously if you've played a first-person combat game before, or first-person games in general. After you learn how to deal with an enemy type's attacks, that is it. And unless you're using the strategy I outlined where you simply run away from the enemies, as I had said earlier, then there is no intricacy in having multiple enemies chase you, no sort of additional layers to the combat that you might find in most beat-em-ups or general combat-heavy games. This is because, with very few exceptions, the enemies simply come at you one at a time. If there is one piece of satisfaction or deliberate enjoyment I can find that was created by this game's design, it is the rhythmic bobbing combat and first encountering a new enemy type and figuring out how to deal with them. And if the game were all about introducing new exciting enemy types that attacked in new ways that you had to figure out new ways to get around, then the game would probably be pretty good, but the surrounding design is actually so bland and one-note that it recontextualizes any fun from the combat or any nuance from the combat as a small 3 to 4 minute bright spot in an hour-long video game. It's not great.